A billionaire's dying wish was to see his lost wife. And then a miracle happened. Doctors say he has only weeks left to live, and all he wants is one last look at the woman he loved, the woman who vanished in a plane crash 10 years ago. But on a stormy night, when he's ready to say goodbye forever, a woman who looks exactly like her appears at his gate, younger, confused, and holding a secret she should never know. She says she came because of a letter he hasn't even written yet. His heart starts healing the moment she arrives. But if she really is his wife from the past, then the clock is ticking, because she's walking toward the same tragedy that took her life before. If you were given one last chance to save the person you love, even if it destroys everything you know, what would you do? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead as Dylan Locke sat in the familiar leather chair of Dr. Samuel Hart's private office. His trembling fingers clutched the fresh scan results, the paper crinkling beneath his tight grip. The morning light filtering through the windows seemed as grey as his spirits, matching the overcast Monday that loomed outside. Dr. Hart leaned forward at his desk, his kind eyes filled with the weight of decades of friendship. He cleared his throat, choosing his words with careful precision. "Dylan, I wish I had better news." He gestured to the images displayed on the monitor between them. "The latest scans show significant deterioration. Your dilated cardiomyopathy has progressed much faster than we anticipated." Dylan's throat felt dry. "How long?" The words came out barely above a whisper. Dr. Hart removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose, a gesture Dylan had seen countless times over their 20-year friendship. 3 months, perhaps less. He paused, his professional demeanor cracking slightly. Without a dramatic turnaround, something beyond what modern medicine can provide. "I'm afraid that's all we can expect." Dylan nodded slowly, his face a mask of composure that betrayed none of the storm raging within. He'd suspected as much, had felt it in the growing weakness in his limbs, the constant fatigue that seemed to seep into his bones. "I appreciate your honesty, Sam. You've always been straight with me. We can adjust your medications, try to make you more comfortable," Dr. Hart offered, though they both knew it was little more than a token gesture. "But Dylan, you need to start putting your affairs in order." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Dylan's gaze drifted to the window, watching a pair of pigeons flutter past. "My affairs have been in order since Amelia disappeared," he said quietly. "Haven't had much else to do these past 10 years but prepare for the end." Dr. Hart's eyes softened at the mention of Amelia. He had known them both since college, had celebrated at their wedding, had watched their love story unfold, and then shatter with that fateful plane crash. "Dylan, It's all right, Sam." Dylan stood, straightening his tailored suit jacket with practiced precision. "We both knew this day was coming. The heart can only take so much grief before it gives out entirely." Outside the clinic, Dylan's chauffeur held the car door open, shielding him from a light drizzle that had begun to fall. As he sank into the plush leather back seat, Dylan watched the city blur past his window. Each building, each street corner held some memory of Amelia. Here was the cafe where they'd had their first date, there the park where he'd proposed, the boutique where she'd always bought her favorite perfume. The memories washed over him like waves, bittersweet and relentless. Amelia's laugh, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, how she'd dance in the kitchen while making breakfast. 10 years gone, yet the pain felt as fresh as yesterday. The plane crash had taken more than his wife. It had stolen his joy, his future, his very reason for living. The car pulled up to his mansion's circular driveway, where Evelyn Grant stood waiting. as she had every day for the past 20 years. Her weathered face showed immediate concern as she took in his pallor. "Oh, Mr. Dillon," she said softly, helping him with his coat. "It wasn't good news, was it?" Dillon led her to the kitchen, her domain, where they'd shared countless conversations over cups of tea. He sat heavily at the marble island while she put the kettle on, their familiar routine a small comfort in the face of devastating news. 3 months, Evelyn, he said simply, watching her hands freeze momentarily over the tea canister. Maybe less. The kettle whistled, its sharp cry cutting through the heavy silence. Evelyn's hands shook slightly as she prepared the tea, adding honey the way she knew he liked it. When she turned to face him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I'll be increasing my prayers for you," she said firmly, her voice wavering but determined. "The good Lord isn't finished with you yet, Mr. Dillon. I feel it in my bones." Dillon managed a small smile for her benefit. Evelyn had been more than a housekeeper. She'd been a mother figure, a friend, a constant source of strength through the darkest decade of his life. "Your faith has always been stronger than mine, Evelyn." "Then I'll have enough for both of us," she replied, reaching across the counter to squeeze his hand. "You just keep fighting." As evening settled over the mansion, Dillon retreated to his vast bedroom, where shadows stretched across the tastefully decorated space that had never felt like home without Emilia. He sat at his desk, pulling out the leather-bound journal he'd kept since the day she disappeared. Its pages were filled with 10 years of thoughts, prayers, and conversations with a wife who would never read them. Opening to a fresh page, Dillon began to write by the soft glow of his desk lamp. His pen moved slowly across the paper, each word carrying the weight of finality. "My dearest Emilia," he wrote, "today I learned that I'll be seeing you sooner than I expected. 3 months, the doctors say. I should be scared, but honestly, I'm tired of being here without you. My only regret, my only wish, is that I could see you one last time. Just once, to tell you all the things I never said, to hold you again, to make peace with everything we lost." He paused, watching a tear splash onto the paper, blurring the ink. "I miss you," he whispered to the empty room, his words barely disturbing the silence. "I've missed you every day for 10 years, and soon I won't have to miss you anymore." Dillon closed the journal gently, unaware that at that very moment, somewhere in the vast tapestry of time and space, the universe had heard his whispered plea. Unknown to him, the machinery of miracle had already been set in motion, preparing to answer the deepest wish of his dying heart. The weak morning sunlight filtered through the mansion's tall windows, casting pale ribbons across Dillon's bedspread. His phone buzzed incessantly on the nightstand, each notification bringing a fresh wave of dread. Somehow, the news of his condition had spread beyond Dr. Hart's office, and now his inbox was flooding with messages of sympathy and support. Dillon scrolled through the headlines with growing unease. Billionaire Dillon Locke's heartbreaking final wish. Real estate tycoon's last hope, to see lost love once more. Dillon Locke's terminal diagnosis sparks nationwide sympathy. The story had caught fire in philanthropic circles, where he'd once been known for his charitable work with Emilia. "Mr. Dillon?" Evelyn's gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. "The documentary team is here. They're setting up in the library." He sighed heavily, remembering the agreement he'd made last week to participate in a tribute video for an upcoming charity gala. The timing now felt almost cruel. "Tell them I'll be down in 15 minutes, Evelyn." In his closet, Dillon selected one of his perfectly tailored suits, navy blue, Emilia's favorite color. His hands shook slightly as he fastened the buttons, a reminder of his weakening condition. The man in the mirror looked tired, his dark hair touched with gray at the temples, his blue eyes carrying shadows that hadn't been there in photos from 10 years ago. The documentary team had transformed the library into a makeshift studio. Lights stood like sentries among the bookshelves, and cables snaked across the antique Persian rug. The director, Sarah Chen, approached with a sympathetic smile. "Mr. Locke, thank you for still agreeing to do this," she said warmly. "We'll keep it as brief as possible." Dylan settled into the leather armchair they'd positioned for him. Behind the camera, Sarah asked gentle questions about Amelia. How they met, their early years together, their shared dreams. As he spoke, they projected footage onto a screen beside him. Amelia laughing at their wedding, the two of them cutting ribbons at charity events, candid moments of pure joy that felt like they belonged to someone else's life now. She had this way of lighting up every room she entered, Dylan said, his voice thick with emotion as he watched a clip of Amelia dancing at a fundraiser gala. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was beautiful. It was her heart. She genuinely cared about everyone she met. The interview continued, each memory both precious and painful. When they finally wrapped, Dylan felt drained, as if he'd run a marathon. Sarah thanked him profusely, promising to send a rough cut before the gala. Just as the crew was packing up their equipment, Harriet Locke swept into the library like a force of nature. At 65 years old, she carried herself with the same grace and determination that had seen her through countless society events and family crises. "Dylan James Locke," she declared, using his full name as only a mother could. "We need to talk about these papers my lawyer received this morning." He knew this conversation was coming. "Mother, please. Selling everything? All of it?" Harriet's voice cracked slightly. "The companies you built, the properties you've developed, your father's legacy?" Dylan waited until the last crew member had left before responding. "What good is a legacy without an heir to inherit it?" He asked softly. "I need to put my affairs in order. The foundations will ensure the money goes to good causes." "But you can't just give up." Harriet's carefully maintained composure crumbled. "There are experimental treatments, specialists we haven't consulted." "Mother." Dylan stood and took her trembling hands in his. "I've seen every specialist, tried every treatment. It's time to accept what's coming." Harriet pulled him into a fierce embrace, and for a moment he was a little boy again, safe in his mother's arms. "I can't lose you too," she whispered. "I know," he murmured into her silver-streaked hair. "I'm sorry." They talked for another hour, going over his plans, his wishes, the arrangements he'd already made. Harriet argued, pleaded, and finally accepted, though she never stopped giving him looks that said she wasn't done fighting for him. As evening approached, Dylan felt drawn to the small chapel behind the estate. The stone building had stood there for over a century, though it had been years since he'd attended a service. The path was overgrown now, autumn leaves crunching beneath his feet as he walked. Near the chapel stood an ancient oak tree, its branches reaching toward the darkening sky like gnarled fingers. Dylan knelt beside it, his knees pressing into the soft earth where, 10 years ago, he'd buried a metal box containing a letter to Amelia. It had been a therapeutic exercise suggested by his grief counselor, writing down everything he wished he could tell her. His fingers traced the soil as memories washed over him. The way Amelia had loved this spot, how she'd often come here to think or pray, her belief that this place held something sacred. "I'll be seeing you soon," he whispered, a prayer and a promise mingled together. The first rumble of thunder rolled across the sky as Dylan made his way back to the mansion. The air felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. Wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain, and something else, something indefinable. The storm arrived without warning. What had started as distant thunder transformed into a tempest that shook the very foundations of Dylan's estate. Rain lashed against windows with savage intensity, while wind howled through the trees like a mournful choir. Lightning split the sky in brilliant flashes, briefly illuminating the darkness before plunging everything back into shadow. Dylan tossed restlessly in his bed, the storm matching his internal turmoil. The day's events, the documentary filming, his mother's visit, his quiet moment at the chapel, had left him emotionally drained. Yet sleep remained elusive as thunder crashed overhead. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, urgent knocking jolted him fully awake. Evelyn burst into his room without waiting for a response, her normally composed face pale with worry. "Dylan, come quickly!" She clutched her robe tightly around herself, breathing heavily. "There's someone. I saw someone collapse just outside the gates." He sat up, instantly alert. "What, in this weather?" "I couldn't sleep because of the storm," Evelyn explained rapidly. "And I was checking the security cameras when I saw them fall. They're not moving, Dylan." Despite his doctor's warnings about overexertion, Dylan threw on his robe and hurried after Evelyn. His heart raced dangerously as they descended the grand staircase, but he ignored the familiar tightness in his chest. Someone needed help. The moment they opened the heavy front doors, the storm's fury hit them full force. Rain drove sideways, soaking them instantly. Lightning flashed, illuminating the long driveway leading to the ornate iron gates. "There!" Evelyn pointed, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Through the downpour, Dylan could make out a crumpled form on the gravel. Together, they fought their way through the tempest, their feet splashing through growing puddles. The security lights cast an eerie glow over the scene as they reached the gates. A young woman lay motionless on the wet gravel, her clothes plastered to her body by the rain. Her dark hair spread out like a fan around her head, and angry scrapes marked her exposed skin where she had fallen. "Help me get her inside," Dylan commanded, pushing aside his own physical limitations. Together with Evelyn, they carefully lifted the unconscious woman. She was frighteningly cold to the touch, her skin pale in the harsh security lights. The journey back to the house seemed endless as they struggled against the wind and rain. Finally, they made it inside, water pooling beneath them on the marble floor of the entrance hall. "The sofa in the library," Dylan directed, knowing it was closest. "And bring some blankets, she's freezing." They gently laid her on the expensive leather sofa, and Evelyn hurried to fetch blankets from the nearby linen closet. Dylan knelt beside the woman, checking her pulse, weak but steady. In the warm light of the library, he could see she was young, perhaps in her late 20s. Evelyn returned with an armful of blankets, and together they wrapped the mysterious visitor in layers of soft warmth. As they worked, the woman stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering. Dylan leaned closer, wanting to check if she was fully regaining consciousness, and the world seemed to stop spinning. His heart, already strained, nearly seized in his chest. The woman's features, now visible as she began to wake, were hauntingly familiar. The delicate curve of her cheekbones, the shape of her lips, even the small scar near her left eyebrow. They were Amelia's features, exactly as he remembered them from 10 years ago. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. Yet here was his wife's face, unchanged by time, belonging to a woman who looked exactly as Amelia had when she disappeared. The woman's eyes opened fully, revealing the same warm brown he'd dreamed about for a decade. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice, though weak, was Amelia's voice, carrying the same gentle tone that had filled his heart for so many years. "Where am I?" she asked softly, confusion evident in her expression. Dylan staggered backward, gripping the edge of a nearby armchair for support. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. This woman couldn't be Amelia, Amelia would be 38 now, like him. This woman was clearly younger, as if plucked directly from his memories of 10 years past. "Evelyn," he managed to choke out, his voice rough with emotion. "Would you please make some tea?" He needed a moment alone, needed to gather his thoughts before they scattered completely. Evelyn hesitated, clearly concerned about leaving him in this state, but nodded and hurried towards the kitchen. The sound of her footsteps faded, leaving Dylan alone with this impossible apparition from his past. The woman's eyes had been roaming the room, taking in the familiar library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and warm wooden panels. Now, her gaze settled directly on Dylan, and the confusion in her expression cleared, replaced by something else: recognition. She pushed herself up slightly on the sofa, the blankets falling away from her shoulders. Despite her obvious weakness, her eyes remained fixed on his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Dylan," she whispered, and his name on her lips sent shockwaves through his entire body. Then she spoke words that made the world tilt on its axis. "I came because of your letter, the one you buried by the chapel." Dylan's legs gave out, and he sank into the armchair, his heart thundering dangerously in his chest. The letter, his private goodbye to Amelia, sealed in a metal box and buried beneath the oak tree, had been his secret. No one else knew about it. No one could know about it. Yet here she was, speaking of it as if she had read it yesterday, wearing his wife's face from 10 years ago, looking at him with eyes that held both love and concern. Dylan couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the impossible reality before him. The storm continued to rage outside, but in the library time seemed to stand still as Dylan stared at the woman who couldn't exist, who knew things she couldn't know, who wore his lost love's face like she had been born with it. The sound of Evelyn's approaching footsteps with the tea tray barely registered as his world tilted on its axis, reality bending around this impossible moment. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Dylan's study, casting long golden rectangles across the Persian carpet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a freshly washed world and an impossible reality that Dylan still couldn't fully grasp. The young woman sat across from him in one of the leather armchairs, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She wore borrowed clothes, a soft sweater and pants that Evelyn had found, and her dark hair fell in gentle waves around her shoulders, exactly as Dylan remembered it. "I know this sounds crazy," she began, her voice steady despite the extraordinary nature of her words. "But I'm Amelia. You're Amelia. And yesterday, for me at least, was our first wedding anniversary." Dylan's fingers tightened around his own coffee cup. "That was 11 years ago," he said softly. "I was sitting in our apartment." She continued, her eyes distant with the memory. "Reading the letter you wrote me for our anniversary. It was evening, and I remember thinking how perfect everything was. Then there was this flash of light, like lightning, but different, brighter. It filled everything. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying in the grass near your gate in the middle of that storm." She looked up at him, her brown eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and desperation. "Dylan, what happened to me? Where did I go?" The pain in her voice made his chest ache. He set his coffee down carefully, trying to find the right words. "You disappeared," he said finally. 10 years ago. There was a plane crash." "No," she interrupted, shaking her head vigorously. "No, that's impossible. The flight to Chicago? That's next week. I haven't even packed yet." The color drained from her face as the implications of what she was saying sank in. "Oh, God," she whispered. "The crash hasn't happened yet. Not for me." Dylan watched as she set her coffee cup down with trembling hands, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. This was Amelia's way of crying, silent, with her hands pressed together as if in prayer. The familiarity of the gesture hit him like a physical blow. "I need to be sure," he said gently. "I'm going to call Dr. Hart. He's been my doctor for years now, and he knew you, knows you. Will you let him examine you?" She nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Of course, I understand." An hour later, Dr. Samuel Hart stood in Dylan's study, his medical bag open on the desk as he completed his examination. Dylan watched as his old friend checked Amelia's pupils, blood pressure, and reflexes with professional thoroughness. "No signs of head trauma," Dr. Hart murmured, making notes on his pad. "Vitals are normal. Memory and cognitive function appear completely intact." He looked at Amelia directly. "Can you tell me the last thing you remember before finding yourself here?" "I was reading Dylan's anniversary letter," she said. "It was 7:15 in the evening on April 12th, 2013. I remember because I'd just checked the clock, thinking about starting dinner." Dr. Hart's pen paused on the paper. That had been the exact date, 10 years ago, when everything had changed. He glanced at Dylan, who nodded imperceptibly. "And you have no memory of the intervening years?" Dr. Hart asked carefully. "Because they haven't happened for me yet." Amelia replied, her voice smaller but certain. "I know how this sounds, but I'm telling the truth." Dr. Hart closed his medical bag slowly. "There's no medical explanation for this," he said, his typically confident voice tinged with wonder. "She shows no signs of delusion or confusion. Her memories are clear and consistent. And physically," he trailed off, shaking his head, "she matches all medical records from 10 years ago, exactly." After Dr. Hart left, Evelyn showed Amelia to one of the guest rooms to rest. Dylan stood in the doorway, watching as she settled onto the bed, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Within minutes, she was asleep, her face peaceful and young and achingly familiar. He couldn't stop staring at her. Every detail was perfect, the small freckle near her temple, the way her left hand curled slightly when she slept, the soft sound of her breathing. This wasn't just someone who looked like Amelia. This was Amelia herself, preserved exactly as she had been on that last normal day before everything fell apart. Dylan's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where the constant ache of his failing heart had been his constant companion for months. Something felt different. The irregular flutter that had become so familiar was steadier now, more rhythmic. For the first time in longer than he could remember, his heartbeat felt normal. He stood there, one hand pressed to his chest, feeling the steady thrum beneath his fingers as he watched the impossible miracle sleeping before him. His Amelia, young and whole and somehow here, while his heart beat out a stronger rhythm than it had in months. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to peek through Dylan's bedroom windows when his eyes opened. For a moment, he lay still, waiting for the familiar heaviness in his chest, the struggle to take a deep breath that had become his constant morning companion. But something was different. He sat up slowly, pressed his hand to his chest, and took an experimental deep breath. The air filled his lungs easily, without the usual strain. Even more surprising was the energy coursing through his body, a vitality he hadn't experienced in years. "This is impossible," he whispered to himself, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. His muscles felt stronger, more responsive. The chronic fatigue that had plagued him was noticeably diminished. As he made his way downstairs, voices drifted up from the kitchen, Evelyn's warm, maternal tone, and another voice that made his heart skip. Amelia. So it hadn't been a dream after all. He paused in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene before him. Amelia sat at the breakfast counter, her eyes wide with wonder, as Evelyn demonstrated how to use a smartphone. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing borrowed clothes that were slightly too big for her. "And you're saying everyone has one of these now?" Amelia asked, carefully touching the screen. "Even children?" "Especially children." Evelyn chuckled, then looked up to see Dylan. "Good morning. You're up early?" Amelia turned, and her face lit up with a smile that hit Dylan like a physical force. "Dylan, good morning. Evelyn's been showing me all these amazing things. Did you know phones can take pictures now? And they're instant." He couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. "A lot has changed in 10 years," he said, accepting the cup of coffee Evelyn handed him. "How did you sleep?" "Like a rock," Amelia replied. "Though it's strange being in a guest room instead of our bedroom. I keep forgetting." She trailed off, her expression clouding slightly. The doorbell rang, and Evelyn hurried to answer it. Moments later, Dr. Hart strode into the kitchen, medical bag in hand. "Dylan, you're already up and about? That's unusual for this time of day." "I feel different," Dylan admitted. "Stronger." Dr. Hart's eyebrows rose. "Let's take a look, shall we?" "Good morning, Amelia," he added, still clearly amazed by her presence. They moved to Dylan's study for the examination. Dr. Hart listened to Dylan's heart, checked his blood pressure, and ran through his usual tests. With each reading, his expression grew more astonished. "This is remarkable," he muttered, reviewing the results. "Your heart rhythm has stabilized significantly. Blood pressure is nearly normal. Even your color is better." He shook his head in disbelief. "I've never seen such dramatic improvement overnight, especially in a case as advanced as yours." Dylan glanced toward the kitchen where he could still hear Amelia's voice. "Do you think... I think we're well beyond what medical science can explain," Dr. Hart said quietly. "Whatever this is, however she's here, it seems to be affecting your condition in ways I can't begin to understand." After Dr. Hart left, Dylan found Amelia in the garden, examining the roses with a puzzled expression. "These are different," she said as he approached. "Ours were yellow. I had them replaced with red ones after..." He stopped, still struggling with how to discuss their separate timelines. "Would you walk with me? There's so much I need to tell you." They walked slowly along the garden path, past the fountain and toward the old chapel. Dylan told her everything, how she had disappeared, how the search teams had found only scattered pieces of the plane, how he had refused to believe she was gone for so long. "I wrote you letters," he said softly. "Hundreds of them, sometimes about important things, sometimes about nothing at all, just whatever I needed to tell you that day." Amelia's hand found his, squeezing gently. "The letter I was reading, the one from our first anniversary. You buried it here?" "Under the oak tree. I couldn't bear to have it in the house anymore, but I couldn't throw it away either." They reached the chapel, and Amelia touched the rough bark of the oak tree. "Dylan," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to tell you something. In my time, where I came from, I'm supposed to fly to Chicago next week, for that job interview at the art gallery." Dylan felt his newly steady heart stutter. "That's the flight," he whispered. "The one that kills me," she finished. Her eyes met his, filled with fear and determination. "I think I know why I'm here, Dylan, why this is happening now. You have to help me prevent it." The setting sun painted the chapel in shades of gold and shadow as Dylan processed her words. The miracle of her presence, his improving health. It wasn't random. She had been sent here now for a purpose. But as hope surged through him, a cold fear followed. If they changed the past, what would happen to this present moment? To his mysteriously healing heart, to Amelia herself? They stood together in the lengthening shadows, hands clasped, as the weight of their impossible choice settled around them like the evening dew. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows the next morning, casting warm patches across the marble countertops. Dylan sat at the breakfast table, watching Amelia spread jam on her toast with precise, familiar movements. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. "You can't get on that plane?" Dylan finally said, his voice quiet but firm. His coffee sat untouched, growing cold beside his plate of barely touched scrambled eggs. Amelia set down her knife with a gentle clink. "Dylan, I have responsibilities. The community center needs me. Those kids count on my art classes." She lifted her eyes to meet his. "I can't just disappear on them." "But you will disappear." Dylan's voice cracked slightly. "Permanently." "We don't know that for certain," Amelia countered, though uncertainty flickered across her face. "Maybe knowing about it changes things, maybe dash." "I can't take that risk." Dylan interrupted, his hands trembling as he reached for his coffee cup. "I've lived through losing you once. I won't survive it again." Evelyn bustled into the kitchen, sensing the tension. "Why don't you two get out of the house today?" she suggested, refilling their coffee cups. "Show Amelia how things have changed. It might help clear your heads." Dylan considered this. "We'd need to disguise you somewhat," he said to Amelia. "The media's been following me closely since news of my condition leaked." 30 minutes later, Amelia emerged from her room, wearing a dark wig and sunglasses borrowed from Evelyn. The sight of her different appearance made Dylan's chest tighten. She looked so unlike his Amelia, yet somehow exactly like her at the same time. They took Dylan's least conspicuous car, a simple black sedan, into the city. Amelia pressed her face to the window, marveling at how the skyline had changed. "The buildings are so much taller," she breathed. "And look at all the electric cars." Dylan parked in an underground garage and led her through the bustling streets. He watched her face light up at each new discovery. Digital billboards, smartphones everywhere, fashion trends she'd never seen. They stopped at a coffee shop where Amelia giggled at the complex drink orders and sophisticated brewing machines. "A caramel macchiato with oat milk," she read from the menu board. "What happened to just regular coffee?" Dylan smiled, remembering how she used to tease him about his simple black coffee preference. "Some things haven't changed that much. I still drink it plain." They walked through a shopping district where Amelia marveled at the technology in the store windows. She spent several minutes watching a demonstration of a virtual reality headset, laughing in delight as the salesperson navigated a digital world. By early afternoon, they reached Memorial Park, a peaceful green space in the heart of the city. As they walked along the tree-lined paths, Dylan found himself getting winded more quickly than usual. Amelia noticed immediately, her hand finding his. "Let's sit for a while," she suggested, leading him to a nearby bench. "You're pushing yourself too hard." "I'm fine," Dylan protested, but sat down anyway, trying to catch his breath. Amelia shook her head, a familiar exasperated expression crossing her face. "You never could admit when you needed to rest. Remember how I used to scold you for working 18-hour days?" 20-hour days sometimes, Dylan admitted. "You'd show up at my office with dinner, insisting I take a break. And you'd pretend to be annoyed, but I always caught you smiling when you thought I wasn't looking." Amelia's thumb traced gentle circles on the back of his hand. "I worried about your health even then." They sat in comfortable silence, watching children play on the nearby playground. A young mother pushed a toddler on a swing, the child's delighted squeals carrying across the park. Dylan felt Amelia's hand tighten in his. "We talked about having children," she said softly. "We had so many plans." We did. Dylan agreed, his throat tight with emotion. Everything changed after I lost you. I threw myself into work, built the company bigger than we ever imagined, but none of it meant anything without you to share it with. The afternoon slowly faded into evening, and they reluctantly made their way back to the car. As Dylan drove them home, the city lights began twinkling to life around them. He glanced over at Amelia, who had removed the wig and sunglasses. She looked tired but peaceful, her head resting against the window. "Thank you for today," she murmured, her eyes growing heavy. "For showing me everything. Thank you for being here to see it," Dylan replied softly. But Amelia had already drifted off to sleep. At a red light, Dylan studied her sleeping face, memorizing every detail. The slight curve of her lips, the way her eyelashes rested against her cheeks, the familiar slope of her nose, all exactly as he remembered from their early years together. Joy and dread battled in his chest as he realized how precious and fragile this moment was. Time was sliding through his fingers like grains of sand, carrying them closer to an impossible choice. The light turned green, and Dylan continued driving through the quiet streets toward home, his sleeping wife beside him, just like countless nights from their past. But unlike those nights, he now knew exactly how many moments they might have left, and each one felt more valuable than all his billions combined. The morning sunlight painted golden stripes across Amelia's guest room as she woke, stretching beneath the crisp cotton sheets. For a moment, she lay still, orienting herself in this strange future world that still felt like a dream. The digital clock on the nightstand read 7:15. Even the numbers looked different here, sleek and modern. Quietly padding downstairs in borrowed slippers, Amelia found her way to the kitchen. It was larger than she remembered, updated with gleaming stainless steel appliances, but the layout remained familiar enough. She began opening cabinets, gathering ingredients with determined purpose. "What on earth are you doing, dear?" Evelyn's voice came from the doorway, tinged with surprise and amusement. "Making breakfast," Amelia replied, already measuring flour into a bowl. "My mother's pancake recipe, the one I used to make every Sunday. Do you still keep vanilla extract in that top cabinet?" Evelyn moved to help, shaking her head with a fond smile. "Third shelf on the right now. But you don't need to cook. You're our guest." "I'm family," Amelia corrected gently. "And I've missed this kitchen." Soon, the warm scent of vanilla and butter filled the air. Evelyn watched in amazement as Amelia worked with practiced ease, humming softly while she mixed batter and heated the griddle. When Dylan appeared in the doorway, still in his robe, he stopped short at the familiar scene. "Is that—" he started, his voice thick with emotion. "Your favorite breakfast." Amelia finished, flipping a perfectly golden pancake. With fresh blueberries, just like always. They ate together in the sunny breakfast nook, laughter floating through the usually quiet mansion as Amelia shared stories about learning to cook from her mother. Dylan couldn't take his eyes off her, watching as she gestured animatedly, syrup bottle in hand. After breakfast, Dylan suggested they look through old photos. In his study, they settled onto the leather sofa while he retrieved several leather-bound albums from a cabinet. "I kept everything," he admitted softly, opening the first book. The pages were filled with memories. Their first date at the local fair, Dylan looking younger and carefree as he held up a stuffed bear he'd won. Their engagement party where Amelia wore that pale blue dress she'd loved so much. Countless moments from their early marriage. "Oh, look." Amelia touched a photo tenderly. "Our trip to the lake house. Remember how it rained the whole weekend?" Dylan nodded, his throat tight. "We played board games and drank hot chocolate. You said it was perfect anyway." "It was," she whispered, leaning against his shoulder as they turned another page. The peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening, followed by Evelyn's quiet greeting. Moments later, Harriet Locke appeared in the study doorway, her usual composed demeanor crumbling the instant she saw Amelia. "Oh, my lord!" Harriet gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, my lord in heaven!" Amelia rose immediately, crossing the room to embrace her mother-in-law. Harriet clung to her, sobbing into her shoulder while Amelia stroked her back soothingly. "It's all right," Amelia murmured. "I'm here. God sent me for a reason. I know he did." "You look exactly the same." Harriet managed between tears. "Just like my dreams. I've prayed every single day." They stayed like that for several long moments, Dylan watching with glistening eyes as his mother received this miracle she'd prayed for. Finally, Harriet pulled back, cupping Amelia's face in her trembling hands. "You have to stay for dinner," she insisted. "Please." That evening, the four of them gathered around the formal dining room table, which Evelyn had set with the good china. The chandelier cast warm light over their faces as they shared a meal that felt both surreal and wonderfully familiar. "Tell us about your time," Harriet requested, reaching for Amelia's hand across the table. "What was happening in your life just before you came here?" Amelia described the community center where she volunteered, teaching art to underprivileged children. She talked about the upcoming fundraiser she'd been planning, the very event she was supposed to fly out for next week. As she spoke, Dylan's hand tightened around his water glass, but he remained silent. "And what about this time?" Amelia asked softly. "Tell me about the years I missed." They took turns sharing stories, how Dylan had grown his company, how Harriet had started a foundation in Amelia's name, how Evelyn's grandchildren had started college. Through it all, Amelia listened intently, her eyes filled with wonder and sadness at this future she'd never known. After dinner, while Harriet and Evelyn cleared the dishes despite Amelia's protests, she found Dylan standing alone on the balcony. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of approaching autumn. "Dylan," she said quietly, moving to stand beside him. "There's something I need to tell you." He turned to face her, his expression guarded. "What is it?" "I feel something strange, like a pulling sensation." She pressed a hand to her chest, searching for words. "It's as if time itself is trying to guide me somewhere, urging me towards something I can't quite understand." Dylan's face paled slightly, his fingers gripping the balcony railing. "When did this start?" "It comes and goes, but it's getting stronger." She looked out at the darkening sky. I think whatever brought me here has a purpose, and we're running out of time to figure out what it is." Dylan said nothing, but Amelia could see the fear in his eyes as he stared into the gathering dusk, his knuckles white against the railing. The weight of unspoken words hung between them, heavy as storm clouds on the horizon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital corridor as Dylan sat patiently in the examination room, his sleeve rolled up, while Dr. Hart took yet another blood pressure reading. The steady beep of medical equipment filled the silence. "This is remarkable," Dr. Hart muttered, checking the numbers for the third time. "Your blood pressure has normalized completely. Heart rate steady at 68 beats per minute." He removed the cuff and made notes in Dylan's chart, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What does it mean, Samuel?" Dylan asked quietly. Dr. Hart sat back in his chair, removing his glasses to polish them thoughtfully. "Honestly, I've never seen anything like this. Your ejection fraction has improved by 20% in less than a week. The arrhythmia that's plagued you for years has virtually disappeared." He leaned forward, fixing Dylan with an intense stare. "In medical terms, we'd call this a spontaneous recovery. But given the timing— Given Amelia's arrival, you mean? Yes. Dr. Hart replaced his glasses, his expression troubled. I'm a man of science, Dylan. I deal in facts, in measurable data. But what's happening to you defies medical explanation. Dylan smiled faintly. Maybe some things aren't meant to be explained. After leaving the hospital, Dylan drove home to find Amelia waiting on the front steps, wearing a borrowed sweater from Evelyn that was slightly too large for her frame. She stood as he approached, her face brightening. How did it go? Better than expected, he replied, taking her hand. Want to go somewhere with me? The drive to the lake took nearly 2 hours, winding through countryside that was just beginning to show hints of autumn colors. Amelia pressed her face close to the window, watching the familiar landscape scroll past. It hasn't changed much, she observed softly. The old Miller farm is still there. And look, the apple orchard where we used to pick fruit. Dylan smiled, remembering countless weekend trips they'd taken along this same route. When they finally turned onto the gravel drive leading to the cabin, both fell silent. The small wooden structure stood exactly as they'd left it years ago, its dark green shutters slightly faded, wild roses climbing the front porch railing. You kept it, Amelia whispered. I couldn't bring myself to sell it. Dylan parked the car and cut the engine. I haven't been here since before. They climbed the creaking porch steps together. Dylan's hands shook slightly as he fitted the key into the lock, and then the door swung open with a familiar groan. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the musty interior. Everything was exactly as it had been. The old plaid couch, the stone fireplace, the collection of board games stacked on the coffee table. Amelia ran her fingers along the kitchen counter, leaving trails in the dust. Remember how we used to make pancakes every Sunday morning? And you always burned the first batch. Dylan chuckled. Because you distracted me. She swatted his arm playfully, then sobered. It feels like yesterday to me. But for you, 10 years. He finished quietly. Sometimes it felt like a lifetime. They spent the next few hours cleaning, opening windows to let in fresh air, wiping down surfaces, and shaking out old blankets. Dylan found cleaning supplies under the sink, while Amelia discovered her favorite apron still hanging on its hook. Together they worked in comfortable synchronicity, moving around each other as naturally as they had in their married life. By late afternoon, the cabin felt alive again. Amelia had insisted on going to the small market in town for supplies, and now delicious smells wafted from the kitchen where she was preparing the pasta dish they'd perfected during their first year of marriage. The sauce needs more basil, she called out, and Dylan smiled, remembering how particular she'd always been about seasonings. As sunset approached, Dylan found an old portable speaker in the bedroom closet. After some fiddling, he managed to connect his phone to it. The opening notes of their wedding song filled the cabin. At Last, by Etta James. Amelia appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes grew bright with tears as Dylan held out his hand. May I have this dance? She stepped into his arms as naturally as breathing, her head finding its familiar place against his shoulder. They swayed slowly in the fading light, dust motes swirling around them like golden snow. I'm scared, Dylan, she whispered after several moments. Of what? Of what happens next. Her fingers tightened on his shoulder. I feel it getting stronger every day, that pull, like time itself is trying to draw me back. But how can I go back now, knowing what I know, knowing that flight will— She couldn't finish the sentence. Dylan held her closer, his heart aching. Maybe that's why you're here, to change things. But what if changing things means losing this? She pulled back slightly to look up at him. What if I have to choose between staying in a future that isn't mine or returning to die? The music continued playing softly as Dylan struggled to find words. I don't know, he finally admitted. But I do know that having you here, even for these few days, has been more than I ever dared hope for. They danced until the song ended, holding each other in the growing darkness. Finally, Amelia stepped back, wiping her eyes. The pasta will get cold, she said with a watery smile. They ate by candlelight, sharing memories of other meals in this same kitchen, other evenings spent watching the sunset over the lake. But beneath their conversation ran an undercurrent of urgency, of time slipping away like sand through their fingers. The drive home that night was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. Amelia dozed in the passenger seat while Dylan navigated the dark roads, stealing glances at her peaceful face. He could feel his heart beating steady and strong in his chest, a heart that seemed to know she was there, that responded to her presence like a flower turning toward the sun. When they pulled into the mansion's circular drive, neither made a move to get out of the car immediately. The weight of their limited time together hung heavy in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Finally, Amelia reached over and squeezed his hand. Thank you for today, she whispered, for giving me back a piece of our past. Dylan turned his hand over to lace his fingers through hers, holding on to this moment for as long as he could. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Dylan's bedroom ceiling as he lay awake, planning the day ahead. His heart felt stronger than it had in years, and with that strength came an overwhelming desire to make every moment count. He wanted to give Amelia a day filled with the simple joys they once shared, before time and tragedy tore them apart. By 7:30 he was already downstairs coordinating with Evelyn, who packed a picnic basket with all of Amelia's favorites: crusty French bread, sharp cheddar cheese, fresh strawberries, and the chocolate chip cookies she always loved. As she worked, Evelyn hummed softly, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy at seeing the spark of life return to Dylan's face. The garden should be perfect this time of year, Dylan said, checking his phone for the weather forecast. I've arranged for private access. No tourists, no guides, just us. She'll love that. Evelyn smiled, wrapping the cookies carefully. That girl always did prefer quiet moments to grand gestures. When Amelia appeared in the kitchen doorway, sleep still clinging to her eyes, Dylan's breath caught in his throat. She wore a simple sundress she'd borrowed from Evelyn's niece, her hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders. Even after all these years, she still had the power to make his heart skip a beat. Good morning, she said, accepting the coffee mug Dylan offered. Why do you both look so suspicious? Can't a man surprise his wife? Dylan asked, then caught himself. But Amelia just smiled, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. What kind of surprise? The botanical gardens were even more beautiful than Dylan remembered. As they walked beneath towering oak trees and past carefully tended flower beds, Amelia's face glowed with delight. She stopped to examine every new bloom, exclaiming over the colors and scents. Oh, Dylan, look at these roses. She bent to inhale their fragrance. They remind me of our wedding bouquet. White roses with pink tips. Dylan remembered. You said they represented how love grows and changes over time. Amelia straightened, her eyes meeting his. You remember that? I remember everything about that day. They continued walking, their fingers naturally intertwining as they strolled past fountains and through arbors heavy with climbing vines. The morning air was sweet with the scent of jasmine, and somewhere nearby a mockingbird sang. At noon, Dylan led her to a secluded spot beneath a weeping willow tree, its graceful branches creating a natural curtain around them. He spread out the picnic blanket while Amelia explored the small pond nearby, watching koi fish swim lazy circles in the clear water. "This feels like a dream," she said softly, settling beside him on the blanket. "A beautiful dream I never want to wake up from." Dylan began unpacking the basket, arranging the food between them. "Maybe it's not a dream. Maybe it's destiny." "Do you believe in destiny?" Amelia asked, accepting a piece of cheese. Dylan considered the question carefully. "I believe in faith," he said finally. "And I believe that sometimes, when we need it most, God gives us miracles we don't deserve. Like this." She gestured between them. "Whatever this is, exactly like this." They ate slowly, savoring both the food and the conversation. Amelia told him about her work at the community center in her timeline, her eyes lighting up as she described the children she helped. Dylan shared stories about the charitable foundation he'd established in her memory, watching her expression soften with understanding. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they packed up the remains of their picnic and drove to the lake cabin again. Dylan built a fire in the stone fireplace while Amelia made tea in the kitchen, humming the same tune Evelyn had hummed that morning. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as they settled on the couch, mugs warming their hands. Amelia curled her feet beneath her, looking more relaxed than she had since appearing at his gate. "Dylan," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He turned to face her, his heart quickening at the serious note in her voice. "Being here, spending these days with you, I'm falling in love with you all over again." She gave a quiet laugh. "Which sounds ridiculous because in my timeline we're already married. But this you, the man you've become, I'm falling in love with him too." Dylan set his mug down carefully, his hands trembling slightly. "Amelia, there's something I need to tell you too. Something I've been afraid to say." She reached for his hand, holding it steady between both of hers. "Tell me." "In my timeline." He had to pause, gathering courage. "In my timeline, you didn't just disappear in that crash. You died. They found the wreckage 3 days later, in the mountains. There were no survivors." Amelia's hands tightened on his as she drew in a sharp breath. "Your death shattered me," Dylan continued, his voice rough with emotion. "I lost myself for years. Everything I've built since then, the foundation, the charitable works, it was all just trying to give meaning to a life without you in it." Tears spilled down Amelia's cheeks as she listened, her body trembling. When he finished, she didn't speak for several long moments, processing the weight of his words. "Thank you," she finally whispered, "for trusting me with the truth." She moved closer, wrapping her arms around him, and Dylan held her as if she might disappear at any moment. They stayed that way for a long time, the fire crackling softly beside them, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. Gradually, their breathing slowed and synchronized. The tension eased from their bodies as exhaustion crept in. Amelia's head grew heavy against Dylan's shoulder, and his own eyes began to close. The last thing Dylan saw before sleep claimed him was their joined hands resting between them, illuminated by the dying firelight. In that moment, he felt more at peace than he had in 10 years. The fire burned lower and lower, orange embers glowing in the darkness like fallen stars. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, its soft patter a lullaby that deepened their slumber. Together they slept, two souls bound by love across time itself, while the night wrapped around them like a protective blanket. The first hints of dawn painted the sky in delicate strokes of pink and gold, filtering through the cabin's windows. Amelia stirred from her position on the couch, carefully untangling herself from Dylan's embrace. Her muscles protested after sleeping in such an awkward position, but she barely noticed the discomfort. Her attention was fixed entirely on Dylan's sleeping face. In sleep, the years seemed to fall away from him. The worry lines that had etched themselves around his eyes softened, and his breathing came steady and deep. Amelia's heart ached as she studied him, truly seeing for the first time the weight of the decade he'd carried without her. His confession from the night before echoed in her mind, not just missing, but gone. Dead. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, making it hard to breathe. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above his cheek, but not quite touching, afraid to wake him. The morning light caught the silver threading through his hair at the temples, physical proof of the years that separated them. Years she had never lived, years that had nearly broken him. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I never meant to cause you so much pain." The quiet ticking of the old wall clock seemed to grow louder, each second a reminder of time slipping away. Amelia knew, with a certainty that went bone deep, that she couldn't stay. The children at her community center were waiting for her in her own time. Families depending on the programs she'd built. Lives she'd promised to help change. Moving with careful silence, she found a notepad and pen in the kitchen drawer. Tears blurred her vision as she wrote, having to start over twice before the words came out clear enough to read, "My dearest Dylan, I must go back. My people need me. If this miracle was meant to happen, God will protect us both. All my love, Amelia." She placed the note on the bedside table, then returned to the couch. Dylan hadn't stirred, his face still peaceful in sleep. Amelia leaned down and pressed the lightest of kisses to his forehead. "Thank you for showing me our future," she murmured. "Even the painful parts. I'll carry it with me always." With one last look at his sleeping form, Amelia slipped out of the cabin into the misty morning air. Her heart felt like it was being torn in two, but her steps were steady as she walked away. Minutes later, Dylan's eyes fluttered open. Something felt wrong before he was even fully awake, an absence where warmth should be. His hand reached out, finding empty space where Amelia had been. "Amelia?" His voice was rough with sleep as he sat up, scanning the room. The cabin's main room stood silent and still, no sign of movement in the kitchen beyond. Dylan got to his feet, ignoring the familiar tightness in his chest as anxiety began to build. "Amelia!" he called again, louder this time. Nothing. He checked the bathroom first, then the bedroom, his movements becoming more frantic with each empty space he found. The note on the bedside table caught his eye, and he snatched it up with trembling hands. As he read the few short lines, his breath came in sharp, painful gasps. "No, no, no," he muttered, crumpling the paper in his fist as he rushed outside. The morning air was cool and damp, mist still clinging to the ground around the cabin. "Amelia!" His shout echoed across the lake's surface, startling a pair of ducks into flight. Dylan ran down to the water's edge, scanning the shoreline in both directions. No footprints marked the muddy bank, no figure walked along the worn paths. Desperation driving him, he plunged into the surrounding woods. Branches whipped at his face as he pushed through the undergrowth, calling her name until his voice grew hoarse. The trees seemed to mock him, every shadow taking her shape for a heartbeat before revealing itself as nothing more than leaves and light. Time lost meaning as he searched. The sun climbed higher in the sky, burning away the morning mist, but Dylan barely noticed. He kept moving, kept looking, even as his chest grew tighter and his breathing more labored. Only when his legs threatened to give out did he finally stumble back to the cabin. The drive back to the mansion passed in a blur. Dylan's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles showed white, but he barely felt it. The note in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, each word seared into his memory. He barely registered parking the car or walking into the house. His feet carried him to his study on autopilot as his mind spun with possibilities. Maybe she was here. Maybe she'd found her way back. Maybe the reality of her absence hit him like a physical blow. His chest constricted violently, pain radiating down his left arm. The room tilted sideways as his knees buckled. Dylan was unconscious before he hit the floor, Amelia's note still clutched in his hand. The last thing he heard was Evelyn's horrified gasp from the doorway, followed by the sound of running feet and her voice calling his name in panic. The study fell silent, except for the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, counting out seconds that suddenly seemed terribly precious and terribly finite. The steady beep of medical monitors slowly filtered through the fog in Dylan's mind. His eyelids felt impossibly heavy as he struggled to open them, wincing at the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. Everything hurt. His chest, most of all, a deep, grinding ache that made each breath a conscious effort. "Easy now," came Dr. Hart's familiar voice from somewhere to his left. "Take it slow, Dylan." Dylan blinked several times, bringing the room into focus. He was in a private hospital suite, machines surrounding his bed like silent sentinels. Dr. Hart stood nearby, checking readings with a carefully neutral expression that didn't quite hide his concern. "What happened?" Dylan's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Your heart nearly failed completely," Dr. Hart explained gently. "The emotional shock combined with your condition, it was too much strain. If Evelyn hadn't found you when she did—" He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. Dylan closed his eyes again, memories flooding back. Amelia's note, the desperate search, the crushing realization she was gone. His chest tightened painfully at the thought of her. "Samuel," he managed. Was there any sign?" Before Dr. Hart could answer, the door burst open. Harriet rushed in, her face pale and drawn. She held her phone in a white-knuckled grip. "Dylan!" She hurried to his bedside, reaching for his hand. Then she noticed his expression and hesitated. "Oh, sweetheart, have you heard?" "Heard what?" The monitors betrayed his rising heart rate with quickening beeps. Harriet's eyes filled with tears. "The flight. The one Amelia was supposed to take. It's crashed, just like before." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Dylan heard Dr. Hart saying something sharp about keeping him calm, but the words were distant, meaningless. "Survivors." The word felt like glass in his throat. His mother's silence was answer enough, but she forced herself to speak. "Initial reports say they haven't found any. They're still searching, but—" A sound escaped Dylan's throat, something between a sob and a scream. The monitor's steady beeping turned erratic as his heart rate spiked dangerously. "Mrs. Locke, you need to step out," Dr. Hart ordered, moving quickly to adjust Dylan's medication. "Dylan, listen to me. You need to try to stay calm." But calm was impossible. She was gone. Again. He'd had her back, had been given a miracle, a chance to save her, and he'd failed. The universe had cruelly let him relive losing her, this time with the added weight of knowing exactly what was coming and still being powerless to stop it. Hours crawled by in a haze of medication and grief. Nurses came and went. Dr. Hart checked on him regularly. Harriet tried to talk to him, but Dylan couldn't bear to respond. He lay there, staring at nothing, occasionally whispering Amelia's name like a prayer. As evening settled over the hospital, exhaustion finally pulled him toward uneasy sleep. In the space between waking and dreams, Amelia's face appeared before him, more vivid than any memory. "Hold on," Dream Amelia whispered, reaching for him with familiar gentleness. "Please hold on, Dylan." He tried to reach back, to catch her hand, to keep her with him this time. But darkness was pulling him under, deeper and deeper. Suddenly, the darkness exploded into chaos. Alarms shrieked through the hospital room. Medical staff poured in, their voices urgent but professional. "Code blue! No pulse, beginning compressions. Get him to surgery now." Dylan was only dimly aware of being rushed through bright corridors, of glimpsing his mother's terrified face as they passed her in the hall. The last thing he heard before consciousness slipped away entirely was Dr. Hart's voice, tight with determination. "Don't you dare give up now, Dylan. Not after everything." Then even that faded away, leaving only darkness and the fading echo of Amelia's plea. Hold on. The operating room doors burst open as the team rushed Dylan's gurney inside. Overhead lights blazed to life, reflecting off steel instruments as nurses and doctors moved with practiced efficiency to save the life of a man whose heart seemed determined to follow his love into oblivion. The operating room hummed with urgent activity as Dr. Samuel Hart stood over Dylan's still form, his surgical mask hiding the grim set of his mouth. Monitors beeped rapidly, their rhythms irregular and concerning. "Blood pressure dropping," called out one of the nurses, her voice steady despite the tension filling the room. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine." Dr. Hart ordered, his hands moving with practiced precision. "We're not losing him. Not today." The surgical team worked in synchronized motion, years of training evident in every movement. Outside the operating room's sealed doors, the clock ticked relentlessly forward as they fought to stabilize Dylan's failing heart. In the waiting area, Harriet Locke sat rigid in an uncomfortable chair, her fingers wrapped around a worn prayer book. Beside her, Evelyn Grant kept a silent vigil, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap. The two women had barely spoken since Dylan was rushed into surgery, both too consumed by fear to find words. "Please, Lord," Harriet whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't take my son. Not like this." Evelyn reached over and squeezed Harriet's hand. "He's strong," she said softly, "and he has something to live for now." Inside the operating room, Dylan's consciousness drifted in a strange, timeless space. Images and memories floated through his mind like leaves caught in a gentle current. He saw Amelia on their wedding day, radiant in white lace, her smile brighter than the summer sun. Her laughter echoed in his thoughts, that infectious sound that could fill any room with joy. Their first home appeared in his mind's eye, a modest apartment they'd furnished with more love than money. He remembered Amelia insisting on painting the walls herself, ending up with more paint in her hair than on the walls. "It adds character," she'd declared, leaving tiny handprints on his shirt as she pulled him close for a kiss. The memory shifted to their first Christmas together, when they decorated a scraggly tree with ornaments from the dollar store. "It's perfect," Amelia had insisted, "because it's ours." BP continuing to drop. The nurse's voice cut through the haze of memories. 80 over 50. "Come on, Dylan." Dr. Hart muttered, focused intently on his work. "Fight." Outside the hospital windows, an unusual warmth crept into the winter air. The courtyard's bare trees swayed in a sudden breeze that felt more like spring than December. A few nurses on break looked up in confusion as warm air rustled through dead leaves, creating small whirlwinds of golden brown. Hours crawled by like years. In the waiting room, Evelyn had taken to pacing, her sensible shoes making soft sounds against the linoleum floor. Harriet remained in her chair, lips moving in silent prayer, clutching her book like a lifeline. The surgery stretched on as Dr. Hart and his team worked tirelessly. Monitors beeped, machines hummed, and time seemed to hold its breath. Dylan's memories continued their gentle parade through his unconscious mind. Amelia teaching neighborhood kids at her community center, her face glowing with purpose. The way she'd touch his cheek when he worked too late, wordlessly reminding him to take care of himself. "Dr. Hart," one of the surgical assistants called out. "Look at this." The surgeon paused, studying the readings before him. Something had changed, subtle but significant. The irregular rhythms were beginning to stabilize, falling into a more natural pattern. "Well, I'll be damned," he breathed, years of medical experience not quite preparing him for what he was seeing. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Hart emerged from the operating room. He pulled his surgical cap off, revealing graying hair damp with sweat. Harriet and Evelyn rose immediately, their faces etched with anxiety. "He made it through the surgery," Dr. Hart announced, his voice carrying cautious optimism. "It was touch and go for a while, but he's stabilized. The next 24 hours will be critical, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "There's reason to hope." Harriet's knees buckled slightly, and Evelyn caught her arm, supporting her. Both women had tears streaming down their faces. "Can we see him?" Harriet asked, her voice trembling. "Once he's settled in recovery," Dr. Hart assured her. "He'll be heavily sedated, but having familiar voices nearby can help." In the recovery room, Dylan lay still and pale against white hospital sheets. Machines monitored his vital signs with steady beeps and whirs. His breathing was shallow but regular, assisted by oxygen flowing through a nasal cannula. Through the window, the unusual warm breeze continued to blow, carrying with it a hint of something indefinable, like the scent of spring flowers in winter or the echo of a half-remembered song. The hospital staff would later remark on the strange weather phenomenon, but for now, their focus remained on their patients. Dylan drifted in peaceful darkness, no longer bombarded by memories. The pain that had gripped his chest was dulled by medication, and his thoughts had quieted to a gentle murmur. He was unaware of his mother sitting beside his bed, of Evelyn bringing coffee and sandwiches neither woman would eat, of Dr. Hart checking his vital signs with careful attention. He was equally unaware of the warm wind that continued to blow through the hospital courtyard, or of the extraordinary thing that was about to unfold. For now, he simply floated in the quiet space between sleeping and waking, his heartbeat steady and strong for the first time in days. The lights in his room dimmed automatically as evening approached, casting soft shadows on the walls. Machines continued their vigilant monitoring, their quiet beeps a testament to his survival against overwhelming odds. Outside his window, the sun began to set on one of the most challenging days of his life, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that went unseen by his closed eyes. Sunlight crept through the hospital blinds, casting thin stripes across Dylan's face. His eyes fluttered open slowly, adjusting to the brightness of the morning. The sharp antiseptic smell of the hospital room filled his nostrils, and he became aware of the steady beeping of monitors beside his bed. His body felt heavy, but the crushing pain that had dominated his existence for so long seemed somehow distant, dulled. As his vision cleared, he noticed his mother sitting in the chair beside his bed. Harriet's face was turned towards the window, but he could see her hand moving to wipe tears from her cheeks. Something about her posture seemed different, not the worried tension he'd grown accustomed to seeing, but something else, something that looked almost like joy. "Mom?" His voice came out raspy and weak. Harriet turned quickly, a warm smile spreading across her face despite the tears in her eyes. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly, reaching out to touch his hand. "How are you feeling?" Dylan took a moment to consider the question. "Tired," he answered honestly. "But, okay, I think. Better than before." Harriet squeezed his hand gently, then took a deep breath. "There's someone waiting to see you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Dylan frowned, shaking his head weakly against the pillow. "Mom, I'm not sure I'm up for visitors right now. I'm still so tired." "Trust me," Harriet insisted, standing up. "This is someone you need to see." There was something in her voice, a certainty, an almost mysterious joy, that made Dylan pause. Before he could protest further, Harriet walked to the door and opened it, gesturing to someone in the hallway. Dylan's heart monitor picked up speed slightly as he heard footsteps approaching. And then she was there. Dylan blinked hard, certain his mind was playing tricks on him. In the doorway stood Amelia, but not the young Amelia who had appeared to him like a miracle days ago. This was his Amelia, aged by the 10 years that had passed, her face carrying the gentle lines of time, but still achingly beautiful. Her dark hair was shorter than he remembered, styled in a way that suited her matured features perfectly. She wore a simple blue dress and carried herself with a grace that spoke of years lived, not lost. "This isn't real," Dylan whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm dreaming. Or the medication." Amelia moved closer to his bed, and he could see tears shining in her eyes. "It's real, Dylan," she said softly. "I'm here. I'm really here." Her voice, older but unmistakably hers, sent a shock through his system. The heart monitor's beeping increased again, and Amelia glanced at it with concern. "Should I come back later?" she asked, worry crossing her features. "No." Dylan reached out his hand, and she took it immediately. Her touch was warm, solid, real. "Please, please stay. I don't understand." "How?" Amelia pulled the chair closer to his bed and sat down, never letting go of his hand. "It's a long story," she began, her thumb tracing gentle circles on his palm. "I did board that plane 10 years ago. I was in my assigned seat, but just before takeoff, I felt this overwhelming urge, like a force inside me insisting I needed to move." Dylan listened intently, barely breathing as she continued. "I switched seats with another passenger. I can't even explain why. It was like something beyond me was guiding my actions. When the crash happened..." She paused, squeezing his hand tighter. "My section of the plane survived, but I was badly injured. It took years of recovery, physical therapy, learning to walk again." "Years?" Dylan's voice cracked. "But why didn't you? I tried to find you," Amelia said earnestly, tears now falling freely down her cheeks. "As soon as I was able, I started searching. But you had moved, changed numbers. The companies you owned were under different names. I didn't know you thought I was dead. I assumed you'd moved on, maybe started a new life. But I never stopped looking." Harriet, who had been standing quietly by the door, wiped fresh tears from her face and slipped out of the room, giving them privacy. "Then last week," Amelia continued, "I saw the news. Your condition, your final wish, to see me again." Her voice broke on the last words. "I couldn't believe it at first. But when I saw your face on the screen, saw how you'd been suffering, I knew I had to get here as fast as I could." Dylan reached up with his free hand, touching her face gently, as if afraid she might disappear. "You're real," he whispered. "You're actually here." Amelia leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "I'm here," she confirmed softly. "And I'm never leaving again." They held each other then, Dylan's arms wrapping around her despite his weakness, Amelia careful not to disturb any of the medical equipment as she embraced him. Their tears mingled as they clung to each other, 10 years of separation dissolving in the warmth of their reunion. The morning sun continued to stream through the window, warming them both as they held each other, neither willing to let go. The steady beeping of the heart monitor had settled into a strong, regular rhythm, as if Dylan's heart, like his soul, had finally found its way home. The days that followed seemed to blur together in a gentle haze of healing and reconnection. Dylan's hospital room became a sanctuary of sorts, filled with soft conversation and tentative joy as he and Amelia began bridging the decade that had separated them. Dr. Hart could hardly contain his amazement during his daily rounds. "Your recovery is nothing short of remarkable," he said one morning, studying Dylan's latest test results. "Your heart function has improved beyond our most optimistic projections." Amelia never left Dylan's side, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair despite the nurse's protests. She'd only step out briefly to freshen up or grab coffee from the cafeteria, always hurrying back as if afraid he might disappear while she was gone. During quiet afternoons, while sunlight painted warm patterns on the hospital room walls, Amelia shared her story. "After the crash," she explained, running her fingers gently along Dylan's arm, "I spent 2 years in intensive rehabilitation. The impact had shattered both my legs, and the doctors weren't sure I'd ever walk normally again." Dylan listened intently, his heart aching for everything she'd endured alone. "But you proved them wrong," he said softly. A small smile touched her lips. "I did. Every day I'd push myself harder, thinking about getting back to you. When I was finally discharged, I started searching." Her voice caught slightly. "But you'd already moved from our old house. The company had different ownership. No one seemed to know where you'd gone." "I couldn't stay there," Dylan admitted. "Everything reminded me of you. I thought I'd lost you forever." Amelia squeezed his hand. "I never stopped looking. I hired private investigators, followed every lead. For years, I felt like I was chasing a ghost, but something inside me kept insisting you were out there, that we'd find each other again." One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold outside his window, Dylan shared his own miracle story. "Something extraordinary happened just before you found me," he began carefully, watching her reaction. "A younger version of you appeared at my estate." Instead of disbelief, Amelia's eyes filled with quiet understanding. "Tell me everything," she whispered. Dylan described the storm, finding young Amelia at his gates, the precious days they'd spent together, and her eventual return to the past. "She wasn't a ghost or a hallucination," he said. "She was real. You were real, brought forward in time somehow to save both of us." "I've always felt my survival wasn't just luck," Amelia said thoughtfully. "That overwhelming urge to change seats, it was like something bigger than me was at work. Divine intervention, maybe. She came because of a letter I'd buried by the chapel," Dylan explained. "A letter to you, written on our first anniversary. Somehow it reached across time and brought her, you to me when I needed it most." Amelia's eyes grew distant, remembering. "That letter. I found it, you know. After the crash, during my recovery, I went back to our old house. The new owners let me visit the chapel, and I found the metal box." Her voice softened. "Reading those words gave me strength to keep fighting, to keep searching." Days turned into weeks, and Dylan's strength returned steadily. The medical staff began talking about discharge plans, amazed by his progress. Every day brought new victories, longer walks down the hospital corridors, better test results, stronger heartbeats. One particularly beautiful evening, as they sat together watching the sunset, Amelia broached the subject of their future. "We have so much to rebuild," she said, her fingers intertwined with his. "But I feel like we've been given a second chance that most people only dream of." Dylan turned to look at her, taking in every detail of her face, the familiar features he'd loved for so long, now carrying the gentle marks of time and experience. "We'll rebuild everything," he promised. "Together this time." "I never lost faith that we'd find each other again," Amelia admitted. Even during the darkest days of recovery, something kept telling me to hold on, that there was a greater purpose to it all. Dylan nodded, understanding completely. The younger you, she saved us both. She was the miracle that rewrote our fate. Finally, after 3 weeks in the hospital, Dr. Hart signed Dylan's discharge papers. "Your recovery has been nothing short of miraculous," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "Whatever guardian angel you have, they've certainly been working overtime." Dylan and Amelia shared a knowing look, both thinking of the extraordinary events that had brought them to this moment. With Amelia's steady support, Dylan took his first steps out of the hospital. The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and new beginnings. Sunlight warmed their faces as they paused just outside the entrance, taking in the moment together. "Ready to go home?" Amelia asked softly, her arm linked through his. Dylan looked at her. His miracle, his love returned against all odds, and felt his heart beat strong and sure in his chest. "I already am home," he replied, "right here with you." The autumn breeze carried golden leaves across the driveway as Dylan's car pulled up to the mansion. Amelia helped him from the passenger seat, her touch gentle but sure. The grand double doors swung open before they reached them, revealing Evelyn and Harriet waiting with tearful smiles. "Welcome home," Evelyn called out, her voice wavering with emotion. She rushed forward to embrace them both, careful not to squeeze too tightly given Dylan's condition. Harriet followed close behind, wrapping her arms around Dylan and Amelia. "The house hasn't felt right without you both here," she said softly. The foyer sparkled with fresh flowers and sunlight streaming through the windows. Evelyn had spent days preparing for their return, making sure everything was perfect. The musty stillness that had pervaded the mansion for so many years had been swept away, replaced by warmth and life. "We've prepared your old room, Amelia," Evelyn said, leading them inside. "Everything's fresh and ready just the way you like it." Amelia's eyes filled with tears as she took in the familiar surroundings. "It's like coming home after a very long journey," she whispered, squeezing Dylan's hand. Over the next few days, the mansion transformed. Rooms that had been closed off for years were opened and aired out. Amelia's presence brought light to every corner, her laughter echoing through halls that had been too quiet for too long. One morning, as they shared breakfast in the sunny kitchen, Dylan watched Amelia chatting with Evelyn about recipes and household matters. It felt so natural, as if the 10 years of separation had never happened. Yet the depth of their appreciation for these simple moments was profound, shaped by their long absence from each other's lives. "I've been thinking," Dylan said, setting down his coffee cup, "about what we could do with our second chance." Amelia turned to him, curiosity bright in her eyes. "What do you have in mind?" "A foundation," he explained, his voice growing stronger with enthusiasm. "For heart patients and plane crash survivors. Something that combines both our experiences, helps others who are going through what we did." "Oh, Dylan." Amelia's face lit up. "That's perfect." They spent hours at the dining room table, drafting plans and sharing ideas. Harriet joined them, offering her organizational expertise from years of charity work. The foundation would provide medical assistance, emotional support, and practical help for survivors and their families. "We could have support groups," Amelia suggested, "where survivors can share their stories and help each other heal. And a medical fund," Dylan added, "for those who can't afford treatment. No one should face these battles alone." As they worked, Dylan noticed how naturally they fell back into their old rhythm of collaboration. Amelia's practical compassion balanced his business acumen, just as it had in their early years of marriage. A few days later, they decided to visit the lakeside cabin. The drive through the woods was peaceful, autumn colors painting the landscape in rich golds and reds. Dylan remembered their last visit here with the younger Amelia, how different it had felt, tinged with urgency and impending loss. The cabin stood waiting for them, its wooden walls weathered but strong. Together, they began the work of bringing it back to life. Amelia threw open windows while Dylan swept away cobwebs. They sorted through old belongings, each item triggering memories that they could now share from both sides of their separation. Remember this? Amelia held up a faded photograph of them on the dock, young and carefree. Our first summer here. Dylan nodded, smiling. You were determined to teach me how to fish. And you were a terrible student. She laughed, the sound carrying across the water. They worked through the afternoon, cleaning and organizing, pausing often to share stories or simply hold each other. The cabin gradually transformed from a memorial of loss into a symbol of their renewed life together. As evening approached, they settled onto the porch swing, wrapped in a soft blanket against the cooling air. The lake stretched before them, mirror-smooth and painted with sunset colors. I need you to know something, Amelia said softly, turning to face Dylan. Her eyes held a depth of emotion that took his breath away. I promise you, Dylan, I will never disappear from your life again. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Dylan kissed her forehead gently, drawing her closer. I think I finally understand why the miracle happened, he said thoughtfully. It wasn't about preparing me for death at all. It was about giving us a second life, a chance to make everything right. The porch swing creaked softly as they rocked, watching stars appear one by one above the lake. The night was peaceful, filled with the gentle sounds of nature and their quiet breathing. In this moment, both could feel the rightness of their reunion, the divine orchestration that had brought them back together. Evelyn had prepared the cabin's kitchen with supplies, and they worked together to make a simple dinner. The familiar domestic routine felt precious now, each small interaction charged with gratitude and awareness of how close they'd come to losing this forever. Later, as they sat by the fireplace, Dylan shared more about his experiences with the younger Amelia. She had your spirit, he said, that same light inside. Seeing her helped me remember who I was before I lost you, who we were together. And now we get to discover who we are now, Amelia replied, her fingers interlaced with his. Older, maybe wiser, but still us at heart. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light across their faces as they discussed plans for the foundation. Their shared experiences had given them unique insight into what others might need in similar situations. They knew the importance of both practical support and emotional understanding. We'll need to reach out to hospitals, Dylan mused, create networks with medical professionals and support groups, and make sure there's a spiritual component. Amelia added, faith was such a crucial part of my survival and recovery. Their voices blended with the night sounds drifting in through the open windows, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, the gentle lap of water against the shore. It was a symphony of life continuing, of hope renewed, of love restored against impossible odds. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Dylan's estate garden, transforming it into an enchanted sanctuary. White chairs formed intimate rows on the manicured lawn, while delicate flower arrangements in cream and blush lined the makeshift aisle. An elegant white arch, draped with cascading roses and ivy, stood waiting beneath the ancient oak tree where Dylan had once buried his letter to Amelia. Dr. Samuel Hart adjusted his tie as he took his seat in the front row, still marveling at the medical miracle of Dylan's recovery. Beside him, Evelyn Grant dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief, her weathered face radiating joy. Harriet Locke sat proudly on the other side, her silver hair caught in the late sunshine, hands clasped in quiet thanksgiving. The small gathering of their closest friends created an atmosphere of intimate celebration. Soft classical music drifted through the air as the guests settled into their seats, their quiet conversations filled with wonder at the journey that had led to this moment. Dylan stood beneath the arch, his heart strong and steady in his chest. The dark suit he wore emphasized how much healthier he looked now. His face had regained its color, his eyes bright with life instead of shadowed by illness. He found himself touching the spot where he used to feel constant pain, amazed at its absence. The music shifted, and everyone turned to watch as Amelia appeared at the start of the flower-lined path. She wore a simple cream dress that floated around her like morning mist, carrying a bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. Her face glowed with an inner peace that touched everyone who saw her. Time seemed to pause as she began her walk toward Dylan, each step deliberate and graceful. Harriet whispered something to Evelyn about angels, and both women wiped fresh tears from their eyes. Dr. Hart watched with quiet amazement, his scientific mind still struggling to reconcile the miraculous events that had brought them all to this moment. As Amelia reached Dylan, their eyes met with profound understanding. They had traversed time itself to be here, their love stronger for having endured separation, loss, and restoration. The minister smiled warmly at the gathered guests before beginning the ceremony. Dylan's voice was clear and strong as he began his new vows. Amelia, we've been given something rare and precious, a second chance at our forever. I promise to cherish every moment we have, knowing each one is a gift. Time tried to separate us, but love found a way to bring us back together. I vow to honor this miracle by loving you more deeply, holding you more closely, and walking beside you with gratitude every day of our lives. Tears glistened in Amelia's eyes as she responded. Dylan, our love has transcended time and defied the impossible. I vow to be your partner through whatever future awaits us, to face each day with the joy of being reunited, and to never take for granted the precious gift of our second chance. You are my miracle, my home, and my heart's true north. As they exchanged rings, a warm breeze swept through the garden, gentle and sweet. Dylan felt a familiar presence in that breeze, as if the younger Amelia, who had appeared in his darkest hour, was offering her blessing. Flower petals danced in the air, and several guests commented later about the unusual warmth and peace that had enveloped them all in that moment. The minister pronounced them renewed in their marriage, and applause erupted from their small but emotional audience. Harriet embraced them both, whispering prayers of thanksgiving. Dr. Hart shook Dylan's hand firmly, his usual professional demeanor softened by visible emotion. Evelyn hugged them through happy tears, reminding everyone of how she had prayed for this day. As the sun began its descent towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant golds and pinks, soft music began to play. Dylan led Amelia to the center of the garden, where a small dance floor had been laid. They swayed together while their guests watched with misty eyes, the golden light wrapping around them like a blessing. Dylan held Amelia close, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume. The moment felt suspended in time, perfect in its simplicity and profound in its meaning. He leaned close to her ear and whispered, "My dying wish wasn't to see you one last time. It was to live with you again." Amelia's smile brightened as she rested her head against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beating of his healed heart. Their future stretched before them, bright and whole, filled with possibilities they had once thought lost forever. The garden glowed in the sunset's light, a gentle breeze still playing through the flowers as love triumphed over time itself. Around them, their closest friends and family watched the dance with joy and wonder, each understanding they were witnesses to something extraordinary. Not just a vow renewal, but a testament to the power of love, faith, and the mysterious workings of destiny that had brought Dylan and Amelia full circle, back into each other's arms where they had always belonged. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.